screen, you can see that we've got an alternative title too, Becoming an Advanced Thinker. And I know that from many of the LPAs, the Learning Portfolio As that I've read and talked about with different students, that critical thinking was one of the things that some of you were a bit concerned about or thought that you needed to develop as one of the graduate skills or enabling skills in your Learning Portfolio A. So today we hope to give you some tools to look at this, but also by looking at that alternative title of Becoming an Advanced Thinker, you get out of that mindset where you are or you aren't, and we focus on the becoming. So by using the tools and strategies that we give to you today, it means that you get to develop those skills, because really becoming a critical thinker is a lifelong journey. And we slip in and out of it too. Sometimes we're really good at it, we lapse a little bit, and then we increase those skills as well. So hence the title, Becoming an Advanced Thinker. And hopefully it takes that freakiness and that scariness out of being a critical thinker. So before I move on, I want you to think about this title slide too, and I want you to start engaging with your own critical thought processes. So you don't have to write down the answers to these questions, just ruminate on them a little bit, but think about what are you predicting when you're looking at this title? What do you know already about this subject? You might have done some preview reading and looked at the learning outcomes in preparation for this module. How are you relating those connections to, or the stuff that you've read in there, to what we might be talking about today? Also, what are you thinking about what you don't necessarily know? So I'll just give you a couple of moments to reflect on that. Make notes if you want, that's fine. So in today's lecture, we're going to look at these things specifically. We're going to have a look at exactly what critical and analytical thinking are. We're going to think about how to evaluate evidence, and some of you already practiced that. We're going to look at some flaws in reasoning, and we're also going to look at a framework, a particular framework, to help us examine an issue from a multitude of angles. So again, before I move from this slide, I want you to consider this list of things. And again, thinking about the predictions you made from the first slide, have they been validated, confirmed, or are you changing your perceptions about what might be happening in this lecture? Again, what do you know about this already? What don't you know? And what sort of connections are you making with your experience? I'll give you a moment to think about that too. So you can see that I'm getting you to actively engage with this material. And really, this is the sort of thing that's already going on in your mind. You're already doing this critical thinking and questioning intuitively, but I'm just bringing your awareness closer to the surface about the types of questions that you need to be asking whenever you're approaching any text. So, why critical thinking? Well, the question is, let's go through these first, shall we? Flaws in reasoning, just to recap and reiterate. Why critical thinking? Why not is more the question. So, critical thinking will assist you in your research. It will help you with your reading and with your writing. It helps you make better choices, and not only as a university student, it helps you make better choices in your everyday life. So critical thinking is a transferable skill that applies across all of the realms of activity that we engage in. Because we're engaged, because it's active learning, it deepens your learning and understanding. By doing that, it helps broaden your worldview. If you're questioning and learning, then you're only learning more about the world around you. And because it's broadening your worldview, it must help your interpersonal skills. And if it's helping your interpersonal skills, then it's going to be developing your cross-cultural understandings. And I don't mean just across different ethnic cultures, I mean across different subcultures and different groups of people that make up our society. And through all of this, you'll recognise, by the terminology that we've used in this list, that it develops your graduate skills. And your graduate skills form a good platform for you to develop more transferable skills throughout the wider world. So you can see here that it's got clear links to independent learning, the graduate attributes, as I've just mentioned, Module 4 with the active reading, and application to across all of your courses. So what is critical thinking? Well, I've mentioned active engagement several times already, so you get a pretty good picture about this is what it's about. So it's an ability to actively engage with information and ideas rather than passively accepting everything that's presented. So even though you might be taking your doing Notes TM or Cornell in your note-taking systems right now, are you just passively accepting what I'm saying? Or are you thinking, oh, I wonder if this is true? Are you making those sorts of questions in your mind to challenge what you're being told? So when we look at an argument, we can use the metaphor of an onion. So we could just look at an onion and think, oh yeah, there's an onion, cool. But to really get to know the onion, to get to the essence of the onion, we need to examine it a little bit further. So in that way, critical thinking is like an onion. We need to look deeper into it, and we need to take back the layers. So some of those layers are not going to be very useful, but we can't really get a good understanding of the onion without engaging with it in some way. So by taking back those layers, we get to feel it. We feel the different textures, because you know there's that smooth surface, but there's also that spongy surface in there. There's the smell, very enticing. If you're a Prime Minister, you might want to taste the onion and engage in it that way. So we don't really get to know the onion unless we really peel back the layers and engage with it. So we could take that metaphor a little bit further too, and we can look at the onion from different perspectives. So if we cut the onion at different angles, we see it in different ways. So we might see it with the rings in that first image. We might see it if we cut straight down the centre, that beautiful sort of bulbous shape that it makes. So we get to see it from different perspectives. So by looking at things from multiple perspectives, we get to see things more clearly or get a better understanding of them. And that's what critical thinking does too. If we look at things from different angles, then we get a better understanding of it. But that brings us to about how you interact with the onion. So your personal value set, your experiences, who you are, must influence how you cut that onion. So you might be a ring cutter, and that's the way that you offer a particular perspective on a matter. Or you might be the person that cuts it straight down the centre. You might be a person that dices the hell out of it. But however we cut it, that's our particular perspective. So we need to also look at the other ways that the onion is cut. So you can see that it's a kind of a good metaphor for critical thinking. So what is it? By doing all of these, then we're employing a whole lot of thinking processes. So it's predicting, and I think I got you to do some predicting earlier, didn't I? It's describing, categorising things, making links between different ideas, making links between ideas or theory and practice, but also asking questions. Now you know that you use all of these thinking processes every day in your everyday life, and you've already used some in this lecture. You use them regularly in your study as well. So we use these thinking processes for the following end goals. We do use it so that we can deeply evaluate evidence. We're not just going to look at it from the surface like we're holding an onion in our hand. We want to go into the core of the onion and really understand it. We check for bias, so whether things are leaning towards one particular perspective. We check for flaws, and we also look for unsubstantiated assumptions. So these are perspectives that don't have any evidence to support them. We make an evaluation about how far that evidence or those opinions are presented genuinely to prove those points. So we're not only looking for points that are proven, we're looking at how well they're proven. And finally, we use it to weigh up opinions, or solutions from a number of angles. So that's critical thinking. What about analytical thinking? How are they interconnected? Because often we use them interchangeably, and you'll find that Cottrell actually bunches them together to critical and analytical thinking. So we're making the differentiation in the lecture so you have that clear conception in your head. So basically, it's an ability to examine or scrutinise information in a logical and coherent way. So what we're doing is taking all of those critical thinking processes and putting them into a framework that will help us give a more rounded, balanced approach to our criticism. So, while critical thinking is actively engaging with ideas, the analytical aspect gives us a system in which to do it. And we'll talk about a couple of those systems later in the lecture. So, again, there might be a particular system that you use, like cutting the onion in a certain way so that you can get to see all of the ideas clearly. You already do this in your natural life, in your regular life, non-uni life. So when you write an essay, for example, you're putting things into a framework, you're finding ways and systems to synthesise that information and produce a coherent whole. Some people I know use spreadsheets to plan parties and holidays and things like that. I can see a few nods in the room, so they're obviously the sequential people. Or when you make a significant purchase, like buying a car or a house, you do systematic research so that you can make a good decision. So we already employ critical and analytical thinking well in our lives. So it involves dissecting and analysing information. It involves breaking down complex things into smaller parts. It's about eliminating irrelevant information from the argument. And it's about focusing on facts and evidence. So really it's a set of thinking processes or skills that an individual has to give them the ability to scrutinise and break down facts and thoughts into their strengths and weaknesses. It's looking at data in a very considered and discerning way so that we can analyse problems and provide solutions. So, now that we've considered what critical and analytical thinking are, so evaluating evidence, weighing up opinions from many sorts of angles, analysing information, what's the point of it? And generally the answer that people give you is that we're looking for truth. Now we've already had that discussion in this class about what is truth and what are truths, and we can continue that too. But let's look at an example to have a look at truth and truths. So, who's familiar with this man? Does anyone recognise him? Julian Assange. So what was Julian Assange notable for, or is he notable for? Anyone? WikiLeaks. He was one of the co-founders of WikiLeaks. And does anyone not know what WikiLeaks is? Good. I'm pleased to hear that. So, you can see here there are a number of commentaries about Julian Assange, quite diverse. So, one of them is that he was a local who made it big. He was an inspiration. So, I'm talking about him in the past tense. He's alive and well. He is an activist for democracy. He's a traitor to democracy, or he's an embarrassment. So you can see that they're quite diverse opinions of who Julian Assange is related to what his activities were with WikiLeaks. So you can see that all of these are valid points depending on the experience of the people who say them. And yes, there's some disagreement in the room, but this is what we're getting at in terms of multiple truths. So here we've got a number of commentators. And each of these commentators link to one of the comments. So I'd just like you to take a moment to make a connection between the appropriate commentator in the letters and the comment, which is numbered. So what do you think? Who do you think said a local who made it big? The Townsville resident, because he is a Townsville boy. Did you know that he went to CQU? Did you know that he didn't finish his IT degree? But he obviously didn't need it. He's Hacker Supreme. So the local who made it big, Townsville resident. An inspiration? An internet hacker, possibly. An activist for democracy? A WikiLeaks supporter? A traitor to democracy? US government, I think so. And an embarrassment? The Australian government. That's right. So just to confirm, Julian Assange, multiple truths here. So you can see here that from this example of Julian Assange that truth is defined by your perspective. And like I said before, with you and how you cut your onion, it's all your values, experiences, your vested interests that inform your particular truth. But it doesn't mean that your truth is different from somebody else's or the same. So what this emphasises is that, you know the expression, there's two sides to every coin. There's often more than two sides to every coin. There's actually that multifaceted edge that joins those two parallel flats. But we need to look for more than dualities, than two sides to things. We need to look from multiple perspectives. So we also, when we're looking at those multiple perspectives, is to still apply critical thought to them. And you all know about this particular framework for analytical thought. You've all used this already. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you go back and read your information literacy guide. But I know that my class are all okay here with this. So RAOC, or in some circles known as RACO, what does the R stand for? Relevance. And the A? Authority. O? Yep, and? Good. So we need to apply this formula, this analytical framework, to not only the reading that we do at university, but we can also employ it to critically think about any source that's being presented to us or information. We can apply that to our everyday life. However, sometimes when arguments are presented quickly or where they're much more passionate and emotive than the types of things that you read at university, then we need to be able to, and when they're not that credible, we need to be able to intervene with some of that incredible information, and some of it is incredible. So we need another subset of skills to look at, and this brings us to flaws in reasoning. So understanding how arguments are crafted is really important for us to interrupt any illogical thought that we see in arguments around us in order to be critical and analytical thinkers. So what we plan to do now is look at some logical fallacies, and these are weaknesses in or oversimplification of arguments, and they often play on emotions. Now sometimes these are unintentional, but sometimes these are presented intentionally in arguments to throw people off their game and to throw them off their critical thinking processes. We also use these unintentionally or intentionally in our everyday discussions, but if you're going to be a credible critical thinker at university, you need to watch your own language too, and try not to, be very careful about using these in your own information production at uni. So by looking at these logical fallacies, we're also giving you some terminology to help you be a bit meta about this critical thinking. So we're giving you terminology so you can think and talk about these logical fallacies too. Because having that language raises your awareness about them, but also allows you to talk about. So, I guess you're all familiar with this man. He's generated many interesting quotes over his reign, I was going to say, while he was in office. But the one that we're going to choose today is this one. So either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. So I can see you all shaking your head and having a bit of a chuckle. So you can see that this is a logical fallacy. It doesn't quite make sense because it forces you into one position or another. It forces you to condone the actions of the US government at that time or be positioned with the terrorists. And I don't think that there's many people that want to choose between either of those. So it's oversimplified that whole scenario, that whole situation, and doesn't give you an understanding of all the grey areas that are involved. So this type of logical fallacy is called an either-or fallacy. So it's when two extremes are set up and you're forced into a position of acceptance of one of them. So another way, term for this one is called manufacturing consent. So he's forcing you to say yes to his position. So it's called an either-or fallacy or manufacturing consent. Politicians use these things all of the time, and you'll see them in advertising too, and you'll hear them around the dinner table, I'm sure. So that's the first one. Let's look at another one. So we've got three well-known faces here. We've got Leonardo DiCaprio, and he's linked here with marine protection. We've got Nicole Kidman, who's linked here with nutritional health. And we've got Mayim Bialik, who's linked with neuroscience and the Big Bang Theory. But how credible are these people for these particular campaigns or these fields of recognition? Shaking heads all around. So let's look at them one by one, shall we? So Leonardo DiCaprio, he's just been appointed as a UN ambassador for marine protection. And I think he's put a lot of his wealth into establishing marine parks. But is he an expert in the field? Maybe not yet. Maybe his engagement with this area will make him an expert down the track, but he's still a celebrity with popular appeal that's drawn attention to that particular campaign. I'm not saying that the campaign's either good or bad, but it's still what we call false authority. Our Nick, yes, she's got beautiful skin, she looks healthy most of the time, and linked to vitamins. I'm not sure what they are, and I'm not sure which company it is. Oh, thank you, brand watchers. Yes, Swiss. And then, so is she a credible head for this campaign, or this advertising campaign? Good, I can see shaking heads. So again, a false authority on nutritional supplements. What about Mayim Bialik? Yes, I can see nodding. Yes, yep, she has a PhD in neuroscience and just happens to be a scientist on Big Bang Theory. So of all the three here, she is the one that is most credible. The other two, in varying degrees, have false authority. So this is the next second logical fallacy. Looking at the third one, we have attack on a person. So see lots of memes on Facebook and Twitter and whatever. Yes, we can see that evil Tony there, being called a fascist. There's also some things on the T-shirt. But really, is he really a fascist? I think that anyone that's come from a fascist regime would be quite happy about living in Australia, and it is deflecting from the actual arguments on policy or whatever. The second photo is from a union gathering. It's protesting wage cuts and job losses from British Airways. And Willie, I believe, was the CEO at the time, who was also caught going on binge holidays to Thailand. So there's a comment on Willie there. But again, it's not looking at the issues at play, it's attacking the man. And this is called argumentum ad hominem. It's a Latin term which means attack to the person. So when you see it online or in the study guide, it'll just be called ad hominem, an ad hominem attack. So the next one, I need to do a little bit of reading this time, is based on a scenario. So here, the scenario is that fast food workers in the US staged a strike, very protest-oriented today, aren't we? Demanding a pay rise to $15 an hour, not for an extra $15 an hour, to $15 an hour. And the retort by someone, and I'm not sure who it was why stop at $15? Why not just give them $100,000 an hour? So, we know that someone working at Macca's in the drive-thru is not going to be earning $4 million a week, ever. So this is what we call a slippery slope argument. By saying, if we do this, then we're setting a dangerous precedent that's going to end up with some untenable and extreme consequence. So we know that this is not going to happen. And we also know that $15 an hour is probably pretty fair. So this is called a slippery slope argument. I'm going to show you another argument now, which is kind of framed like a slippery slope argument, but it goes in the opposite direction. So the quote is, climate change poses clear catastrophic threats. We may not agree on the extent, but we certainly can't afford the risk of inaction. So here, the initial position is inaction. And the consequence, and this is where we might differ about what you think whether the consequence is extreme or not, the consequence is disastrous effects of climate change. So, is it a slippery slope? It really depends on your perspective and whether you believe the evidence of climate change or not. And we're not going to discuss this now. I'm just pointing this out as an idea of thinking about the thinking. So, some people would say that this is a slippery slope argument, but others would not. Others would say this is a true scenario. Let's have a look further at this example though. Can you see another potential logical fallacy in this quote? Jack? Yeah, so Jack said the bottom quote is by Rupert Murdoch, and so he doesn't really trust him. So in terms of the logical fallacies that I've introduced already, what might this be? False authority, that's right. Because he's not a climate change scientist. He's scarily a man with a lot of power whose opinion many people follow. So, yes, it could be a slippery slope argument, depending on your worldview and your perspectives, but we need to question Rupert Murdoch and his credibility on this topic. So, slippery slope argument here? Maybe not, maybe, certainly false authority. The last one that I want to look at is a quote more from our home shores. Poor people don't have cars and they don't drive far. Said last year, post-budget, by our then Treasurer. So, is this true? Can we make this statement? Is it true for every poor person? Definitely not. And we know that students are poor, and we know that most of you drive here, and most of you drive far. You come from the outskirts of Mackay. So, and it was actually, I don't know whether any of you go to ABC Fact Checker. Don't say that very quickly. But they go to arguments that have been presented on in different political discussions, and they go through and they check all the facts. And they actually found that many poor people have cars, and in fact, poor people, because they live on the outskirts of cities where there's less transport infrastructure, they actually drive further in order to get to work. There's also the incidents in Melbourne, urban Melbourne, where a lot of poor people no longer own homes. They can't get rental accommodation because the prices are so high, so they live in their cars. So it's their biggest asset. So this is what we call a hasty and sweeping generalisation. It's not true for everyone in that category. So let's just recap for a moment. We've looked at, sorry, just checking my notes here. So we've had a good look at what critical and analytical thinking are. We've considered RAIOC as an example of an analytical framework. And we've also looked at some language to give you some, so you can talk about different logical fallacies. So now I want to look at, go and look at different ways of thinking and another analytical framework that we can use. And the proponent of this particular framework is Edward de Bono. Who's heard of Edward de Bono before? Okay, everyone in EWU, you should be putting up your hands. So Edward de Bono is an amazing man. He is a doctor, he's a physician, he's a psychologist, he's an author, and he's an inventor. He's written 57 books in his field to date. He's still going strong. And those books have been translated into languages all over the world. I think the figure was 40 different languages. So he's well known throughout the world and highly respected. So he says that when we think, that we apply too many thinking processes at once. And this results in muddled thinking. So he suggests, through a particular framework that I'm going to talk more about in a moment, that if we separate all those different types of thinking, we can create a more parallel type of thinking. We become more strategic in that thinking. So we can learn to think more strategically and become better, clearer thinkers. It's something we can learn. Thank goodness. So one of his ideas is that we need to use parallel thinking, where views can run alongside each other, not just against each other. So the thinking where, the name for the thinking where it runs against each other is adversarial thinking. And this comes from and forms the basis of much of Western philosophical thought. So if you think back to the day, back in ancient Greece, back in the Agora, where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were holding ground, a lot of the arguments, or a lot of the approaches to philosophy were about setting up an argument and then people attacking the argument until you found a single truth. De Bono says that that's not useful for us anymore, and we need to move towards parallel thinking. And you can see from that example that we had about Julian Assange, where we had all of those different ideas, all of them were true, depending on people's perspectives. All of those ideas should be laid out on the table so that we can see all those different perspectives. And this is what Edward de Bono wants us to do. So by doing that, it means that we can have all of the ideas spread out. It means we can look at them collectively and be creative about moving in the same direction, but still honouring all of those different truths. So he also talks about lateral thinking. So he's got this very systematic parallel thinking structure, but he also acknowledges that creative thinking is also really important, especially as our society moves so quickly and progresses on so many different fronts, that we need to harness both parallel thinking and lateral thinking to move forward and keep up with the changes that are happening around us, but also to implement those changes. So lateral thinking is more creative in its approach, and it's solving problems through an indirective or creative approach to get to reasoning that's not necessarily immediately obvious. But we're not going to talk so much about the lateral thinking today, but we will go and have a look at the parallel thinking. So the parallel thinking framework, and now you'll all go, oh yes, now I remember De Bono, is the 6 thinking hats. So he's built on that idea of the thinking cap. So you know we've all heard that expression, put your thinking caps on. So he's built on that and acknowledged that the brain actually thinks in a number of different ways. So he's separated those thinking strategies into 6 parts, and he's given each one a hat. And he's done this on purpose so people who are learning these thinking strategies are very deliberate about putting on a particular hat and going through that motion so that it's a very deliberate change of focus. So by putting on a hat, you're giving your whole body a message that you're going to think in a particular way. So you can see here that there are 6 hats, all different colours, and white is related to facts, red is to feelings, blue is generally to control, green to creativity, yellow to positive, and black to negative. Before I go and explain these further, what I'd like you to do is just using your birth month is find the hat that's related to you. So for example, if you were born in January or February, I want you to take control of the white hat for the next 15 minutes. If you're born in March or April, take control of the red hat's yours. If you're born in May or June, yours is the blue hat, and so on. So I just want to check that we've got all the hats covered before I go further. So who's going to be wearing the white hat? Good. Who's going to be wearing a red hat? Oh, look at you all. Who's going to be wearing a blue hat? The green hat? Yellow? And black. Excellent. We're well covered. So let's go through them and have a look at them with a bit more detail. So the white hat is about information and facts. So it's very fact-oriented. You'll be looking at research and statistics. You're looking for evidence that backs up arguments specifically. You're much more objective in your approach, and you'll follow logic. And I like to use a chef here because I like to think that chefs are very precise with their ingredients and following recipes. Works for me. So, white hat, information and facts. Red hat is about emotions. So red is always, it's usually connected with love, with anger, and all of those passionate kind of emotions. So it's related to feelings, personal opinion, intuition, and generalisations. So this could be the realm of the logical fallacy, perhaps. The blue hat is about big picture thinking, and I like this picture because it sort of denotes that global thinker. So it's about summarising, it's about control, it's about planning, it's thinking about thinking, and it's maintaining focus. So this whole lecture really is about blue hat thinking because we're thinking about thinking. We're standing outside and looking at the thinking. The green hat, I like to think of jungles and growth and plants because it is about growth. It's about progress and moving forward. It's about alternatives and creativity, proposals, suggestions, new ideas, new thinking. The yellow hat, think sunshine, smiley faces. It's about positivity, good points, success and the likelihood of it, assessing things for their value, strengths, advantages. And the black hat. We're looking at negatives here, but not critical negative thinking necessarily. We're thinking about risk assessment, feasibility, caution, and what's wrong with this picture. And what is wrong with this picture? Mr. Heisenberg, I don't think he wore his black hat very often because he didn't make very good choices. Did he? So, you've all got your hats allocated and you've all got some notes about what that hat means. Now I'm going to get you to apply it to a particular situation. So this is an article that appears in the study guide, and the article is "Call to Legalise Marijuana Reignites as Figures Show Queensland is Country's Cannabis Capital." There's a rumble in the room. So Queensland title, "As the Cannabis Capital of Australia has reignited calls for the controversial drug to be legalised, this time as a revenue for government coffers." So I'm going to present some information here for you, and I want you to use your allocated hat to write down some notes related to this topic. So, first of all, we have a photo. Does anyone recognise this man? Barack Obama. That's right, with a nice little spliff in his hand. And another meme. It looks like it's 50s, but I think it's a little bit later than that, possibly 80s. So it says, "Marijuana, hey, at least it's not crack." And then we've got 3 facts here. There's one about police arrests and the amount of money was generated, or the amount of worth that the pickup was worth. There's a comment from a doctor. Oh, you guys can't see that very well. It's on the small screen. Sorry. I'll read it out to you then. So point 1, police made 18,000 odd arrests and 18,000 seizures in Queensland in 2012 to 2013, netting 813 kilograms of marijuana worth $40 million. Second fact, Bond University criminology professor Dr. Goldsworthy says marijuana is far too dangerous to be legalised. Cannabis can trigger psychotic episodes, and users become more susceptible to harder drugs. And the final point, in the US, numerous states have legalised the drug. It costs $1 billion per year to police and tax revenues, and that is worth $3.5 million per month. So, the next 2 minutes, make some notes about how this information might relate to your hat. 2 minutes. And for distance students, I'm just going to turn the camera around so you can see the people in Mackay working too as you do your work. It might feel like you're in a little study clique. There you go. I'm also going to turn my mic off for this period. Good. So, how did you go? Good. Thank you, Jen. What about some white hat information? Can we have 1 point from a white hat perspective? Anybody? No? So we do have some very clear facts here. We've got the very clear information about the amount of money that things were worth, the amount of drugs that were seized and how many arrests were made. So there's quite a few facts in there that we could use to support an argument either way. What about red hat responses? Anybody?
Yeah, I was thinking of the Bond University professor, like he's a professor of criminology, not psychology, so he's making a pretty big statement about it to trigger psychotic episodes and stuff, but he's just a criminology professor, like maybe he was a psychologist or something like that, maybe I guess he'd be a bit more. And also about like, is he being paid to make a statement like that? I think he's from the criminology sector, and so he's his, he's sort of more inclined to say something like that.
Yep, sure. So I don't know that distance students actually heard Reed's comment, but it was basically that perhaps Dr. Goldsworthy is a false authority, that he might not be an expert in that particular field of psychosis. He's involved in criminology. Absolutely. So did that make you a little bit angry, Reed? Is that why it's a red hat response? Yes, okay. So what about blue hat thinking? Any blue hat thinkers?
Like the revenue that they're making from actually selling it compared to like repossessing and stuff like that, could you challenge those wages kind of thing, the amount of money that they're making, the amount of money that they're taking? And like you're looking at Barack Obama, like he's smoking a split, but now he's the president. Like, can't really do that.
So Andrew's comment was, if Obama's smoking a spliff, it can't be that bad because look where he is now. But he also questioned some of the money intake and how that could be put to good use. So what we can do here is also look at this in terms of structuring an argument. So you might take the positives for the argument. So all the yellow-hatted thinkers have got some positives there. You can also take the disadvantages or the negatives and look at solutions as well. So because we're running short of time, I'm sorry, yellow, green and black-hatted people, I know you want to say something, but I'm just going to zip through this now. So the positives from the screen is that it's quite profitable, it seems, for the government, and there's already a wide market, so it's an easy market to get into. The negatives could be, if Dr. Goldsworthy is correct, that it can trigger psychosis. And solutions? Well, that's for another discussion, isn't it? Well, there's plenty there. So, by using the 6-hat framework, it allows us to use parallel thinking. It encourages us to use creative thinking as well, and it provides a variety of ways to approach issues. It gives thinkers a greater flexibility and adaptability, especially as times change. And so it prepares us for those changing times. And that's the whole work of de Bono's framework, but also his institute. So in conclusion, to be an advanced thinker, you need to be able to step back from the information that's given. You need to be able to look for flaws in reasoning and or evidence. You need to be able to examine information from a multitude of angles. You need to be aware of your own preconceptions too and how that influences how you take in information, but also how you give information. And you need to ask questions. So I'm wondering, as you went through, were you continuing that little game of prediction in your head, predicting what was coming up in the lecture, confirming, validating, rejecting as you went along? What sort of questions were going on in your mind, and what sort of questions have you written in the creative column of your notes? That's my time up. So the idea is that we can cut the onion and we can cut it in many ways, and now you've got a few more tools to make it more comfortable for you if you were feeling uncomfortable about it before. So, to finish off week 10, we encourage you to go onto Moodle and read Perkins and Brown's 2014 article, What Price Precious Playtime? So you'll find that on Moodle, and you'll need it for your Learning Portfolio B. Also, go into Module 10, the Module 10 section of Learning Portfolio B, and answer those questions in 450 to 550 words. Because it's week 10, it's getting close to the time of submission, so make sure you carefully edit and proofread all of that Learning Portfolio. Check that your overall total, is no more than 2,000 words, no less than 1,400, but also make sure that you deduct 850 words from the words in the template so that your word count is accurate. And submission date, Friday, 2nd of October. Oh, look at that. I keep forgetting about the pulsing items in the list. So just to reinforce that in your mind. There's some references that we use because we need to show that we're using good evidence in our lectures. And thank you, everyone. I hope you found it thought-provoking.